The gunshot that shattered the morning silence sent Grace Johnson stumbling backward into the mercantile, her basket of mending tumbling across the dusty floorboards as three masked riders thundered past, whooping and firing into the air. She pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, watching through the window as they disappeared down the main street of Montana City in a cloud of dust and chaos. It was September 1878, and though the wild days were supposed to be settling down, Montana Territory still had plenty of rough edges that could cut a person if they weren't careful. Grace steadied herself and bent to collect the scattered clothes she took in for mending, her only source of income since her father had fallen ill 3 months ago. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gathered the garments, and she forced herself to take a deep breath. The riders were gone now, probably just blowing off steam after a cattle drive or a long night at the saloon. She had more pressing concerns than rowdy cowboys. The bell above the door chimed as she entered Hutchison's general store, and Mr. Hutchison looked up from his ledger with a sympathetic expression that made Grace's stomach tighten. Everyone in town knew about her father's condition. Everyone knew she was struggling. "Morning, Miss Johnson," he said quietly. "How's your father today?" "Not well," Grace admitted, setting her basket on the counter. "The fever came back last night. Doc Miller says he needs medicine, the kind that has to be ordered from back east. It's expensive." Mr. Hutchison nodded slowly, his weathered face creasing with concern. "How expensive?" $50. The number hung in the air between them like a death sentence. $50 might as well have been $500 for someone like Grace, who barely scraped together enough for food and rent each week. Her father had been a carpenter before the illness took hold, respected and steady, but all their savings had gone to previous treatments that hadn't worked. "I'll take whatever mending work you have," Grace said, lifting her chin. "And I can do washing too. Anything." Mr. Hutchison glanced at the basket she'd brought. "I've got 3 shirts here need fixing. That'll be $1.50 when you're done." He hesitated, then added gently, "Grace, that's good work you do, but even if I gave you all the mending in town, it wouldn't add up to $50 fast enough." She knew he was right, but she refused to let despair show on her face. "I'll find a way." As she left the store with the new mending work, Grace's hand unconsciously went to her hair, twisted into a thick braid that hung down to her waist. It was her one vanity, the color of honey in sunlight, thick and healthy even when the rest of her felt worn thin. Her mother used to brush it every night before she died, telling Grace it was beautiful enough to rival any fine ladies in San Francisco or New York. The thought that crystallized in her mind was desperate, but desperation had become familiar territory. There was a place 2 streets over, a curiosity shop run by a woman named Mrs. Chen who dealt in unusual goods. Grace had heard whispers that Mrs. Chen bought human hair for wigs and hairpieces that wealthy women back east paid handsomely for. She found herself walking toward the shop before she could talk herself out of it. Mrs. Chen was a small Chinese woman with sharp eyes and a shrewd but not unkind expression. She looked up from sorting through a box of buttons when Grace entered, and seemed to understand immediately when Grace's hand went to her braid. "You want to sell?" Mrs. Chen asked directly. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. "Mrs. Chen came around the counter and examined Grace's hair with professional interest, lifting the heavy braid, testing its texture between her fingers. "Very good quality. Thick, healthy, beautiful color. How much you need?" $50, Grace whispered. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. "This hair very good, but that is high price. I give you 40, please." Grace's voice cracked. "It's for medicine. My father is dying." Something flickered in Mrs. Chen's expression. She studied Grace's face for a long moment, then nodded once. 50, but I take it all cut short. Thank you, Grace breathed. Thank you so much. Mrs. Chen fetched her shears and a clean cloth to drape over Grace's shoulders. You sit. Once it is cut, no changing mind. I understand. The first cut made a soft, whispering sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet shop. Grace closed her eyes and thought of her father, of his gentle hands teaching her to hammer nails straight, of his laugh before the sickness stole his strength. Snip, snip, snip. The shears worked methodically, and Grace felt the weight fall away from her head, felt the strange lightness as her hair was severed close to her scalp. When it was done, Mrs. Chen handed her a small mirror. Grace barely recognized herself. The short crop made her look like a boy, all eyes and sharp cheekbones. She looked vulnerable and strange, but she lifted her chin and met her own gaze steadily. Mrs. Chen counted out $50 in bills and coins, pressing them into Grace's hands. You are brave, girl. Your father is lucky to have daughter like you. Grace clutched the money to her chest and managed a shaky smile. Thank you. She went straight to Doc Miller's office, where the elderly physician was cleaning instruments. He looked up in surprise when she entered, his eyes widening at her shorn head. Miss Johnson, your hair. I need you to order that medicine, Grace said firmly, holding out the money. All of it, whatever it takes to make my father well. Doc Miller took the bills slowly, his expression troubled and admiring at once. Grace, you didn't have to do this. Yes, I did. How long until the medicine arrives? 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather holds. The shipment comes through Helena. He paused. Your father is going to be upset when he sees what you've done. My father is going to live, Grace said. That's all that matters. She left the doctor's office feeling hollowed out but determined. The hardest part would be facing her father, seeing the guilt in his eyes when he realized what she'd sacrificed. She pulled her shawl up over her head and started the walk back to their small house on the edge of town. She didn't see the cowboy watching her from across the street, his blue eyes tracking her progress with an expression of growing concern. Colt Turner had been in Montana City for 3 days, delivering a herd of cattle from Wyoming with his crew. He'd planned to collect his pay, enjoy a few quiet days, and then head back to the ranch where he worked. He was 26, tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and hair the color of dark wheat. He'd been breaking horses and driving cattle since he was 15, and he knew the hard edge of life on the frontier. He'd noticed Grace Johnson the first day he'd arrived, had seen her walking with that thick honey-colored braid swinging down her back, her spine straight despite the worn patches on her dress. There was something about her that caught his attention, a quiet dignity that seemed rare and precious. Now he watched her hurry down the street with her shawl covering her head, and something wasn't right. He'd developed good instincts over years of reading cattle, horses, and weather, and those same instincts told him this young woman was in trouble. Colt crossed the street with long strides and fell into step a respectful distance behind her. When she turned down a narrow lane toward the outskirts of town, he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, miss." Grace jumped and spun around, her hand flying to her shawl to keep it in place. Her eyes were red-rimmed, he noticed, and there was a fragility to her that made something protective surge in his chest. "I don't mean to startle you," Colt said, removing his hat. "I'm Colt Turner. I've seen you around town the last few days, and I noticed you seemed upset. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Grace said automatically, but her voice wavered. "Thank you for your concern." Colt studied her for a moment, noting the way she held the shawl close, the defensive set of her shoulders. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you don't look fine. If someone's bothering you or if you need help." "No one's bothering me." Grace took a breath, and seemed to come to some internal decision. Maybe it was the genuine concern in his face, or maybe she was just exhausted from holding everything together alone. Her hand slowly lowered the shawl. Colt's eyes widened as he saw her shorn hair, the rough crop that looked like it had been done in desperate haste. For a moment he couldn't speak, struck by the realization of what she must have done and why. "You sold your hair," he said quietly. Grace's chin lifted. "My father needs medicine." This was the only way to get it fast enough. Something in Colt's chest constricted. He thought of his own mother, dead these 10 years, who had worked her fingers bloody to keep him and his siblings fed after his father was killed in a mining accident. He recognized that particular brand of fierce, sacrificial love. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Grace Johnson." "Grace." He turned the name over, finding it fitting. "How much did you get for your hair?" She hesitated, then seemed to decide honesty couldn't hurt at this point. $50. The medicine has to be ordered from back east. It won't arrive for 2 or 3 weeks. And in the meantime, I pray my father holds on." Grace's voice threatened to break. "I should go. He'll be wondering where I am." Colt watched her start to walk away and made a decision that would change both their lives. "Wait." She turned back, wariness in her dark eyes. "Let me help you," Colt said. Grace's expression hardened. "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Turner. That's not what I'm offering." Colt took a step closer, his hat still in his hands. "I just got paid for 3 months' work driving cattle. I've got money I don't need right away. Let me help with your father's care, with food and firewood and whatever else you need until the medicine arrives." "I can't accept that," Grace said firmly. "I don't even know you. Then get to know me." The words came out more intense than Colt intended, but he didn't take them back. "Let me buy you supper at the hotel restaurant, just a meal, a chance to talk. If after that you still don't want my help, I'll respect that and leave you alone." Grace stared at him, searching his face for ulterior motives. What she saw there must have satisfied something, because her shoulders gradually relaxed. "Why do you care? You don't know me either." Colt was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "My mother raised 4 kids alone after my father died. I watched her sacrifice everything for us, watched her work until her hands bled. When she got sick, we didn't have money for a doctor. She died because we couldn't afford help." He met Grace's eyes steadily. "I swore if I ever had the chance to help someone in that situation, I would, so let me keep that promise. Please." The sincerity in his voice cut through Grace's defenses. She was so tired of carrying everything alone, so tired of being strong. The idea of sharing the burden, even for one evening, was almost irresistible. "Just supper," she said finally. "And I'll pay for my own meal." "No, you won't," Colt said, but he smiled to soften the words. "Asking a lady to supper means I pay. That's just basic manners." Despite everything, Grace felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "I need to check on my father first, and I need to change. I'll walk you home if that's all right. Then I can come back and collect you in an hour." Grace nodded slowly. She knew she should probably refuse, should maintain her pride and independence, but something about Colt Turner made her want to trust him. Maybe it was the steadiness in his blue eyes, or the way he'd shared his own pain without making it a show. Maybe it was just that she was desperate for someone to care. They walked together through the dusty streets of Montana City, as the afternoon sun slanted gold across the buildings. Colt kept a respectful distance, not crowding her, but his presence felt solid and reassuring. He asked her about the town, about how long she'd lived there, easy questions that didn't press on tender spots. "All my life," Grace said. "My mother died when I was 12. My father raised me alone. He's a carpenter, or he was before he got sick. The best in the territory." Pride and pain mixed in her voice. "What kind of sickness does he have?" The doctor thinks it's something in his lungs, from all the years breathing sawdust. It started as a cough last spring, but it got worse and worse. Now he can barely get out of bed. Grace's hand went unconsciously to her head, to the short hair she wasn't used to yet. The medicine Doc Miller ordered is supposed to help with the inflammation and the fever. It's his best chance. They reached a small but tidy house with a neat garden that was struggling in the late summer heat. Grace paused at the gate. "I'll be back in an hour," Colt said. "And Grace, for what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and slipped through the gate. Inside, her father was awake, propped up on pillows in his bed. Thomas Johnson had been a strong man once, tall and broad-shouldered, but illness had whittled him down to angles and shadows. His eyes, still sharp and loving, tracked Grace as she entered the room. "There's my girl," he said, his voice raspy. Then he saw her hair and his face went slack with shock. "Grace, oh Grace, what have you done?" She sat on the edge of his bed and took his hand, feeling how thin and papery his skin had become. "What I needed to do. I got the money for your medicine, Papa. Doc Miller's ordering it today." "Your beautiful hair." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother's hair." "Hair grows back," Grace said firmly, though her own throat was tight. "You can't. I need you, Papa. I need you to fight this sickness and get well." Her father squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. "I don't deserve you. You deserve everything." Grace blinked back tears. "Now I need you to rest because I'm going to supper with a gentleman this evening and I need to know you'll be all right while I'm gone." That got his attention. "A gentleman? What gentleman?" "His name is Colt Turner. He's a cowboy in town with a cattle drive. He was kind to me today, and he asked me to supper." Grace saw her father's protective instincts flare even in his weakened state. "I'll be safe, Papa. It's just a meal at the hotel restaurant, very public." Thomas studied his daughter's face, seeing something there he hadn't seen in months, a small spark of hope, of something beyond grief and exhaustion. "You'll tell me all about it when you get home." "Every detail," Grace promised. She kissed his forehead and stood. "Mrs. Patterson next door will come sit with you. I'll ask her on my way out." She changed into her best dress, a dark blue calico that was worn but clean, and tried not to look too long at her reflection. The short hair was still shocking, making her look younger and more vulnerable than her 22 years. She covered it with a bonnet and tried to steady her nerves. Colt arrived exactly an hour later, cleaned up and wearing a fresh shirt. He offered his arm, and Grace took it, feeling the solid strength of him through the fabric. The hotel restaurant was the nicest place in Montana City, with actual tablecloths and a menu written on a board. Grace had never eaten there before. It was for travelers and wealthy ranchers, not for carpenters' daughters who took in mending. She felt out of place, but Colt pulled out her chair like she was a fine lady and ordered them both the special: roast beef with potatoes and gravy, fresh bread and coffee. "Tell me about yourself," Grace said when the initial awkwardness settled. "You said you drive cattle. Is that what you've always done?" Colt leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee cup. "Mostly. I grew up in Kansas, worked on my uncle's ranch after my mother died. Learned to break horses, handle cattle, survive on the trail. It's hard work but honest. I like being outside, like working with animals. They're more straightforward than people most of the time." "You have family still in Kansas?" "2 brothers and a sister, all married with kids now." "I'm the youngest and the only one who kept moving around. I've worked ranches from Texas to Montana, driven herds along the Goodnight-loving trail, spent time in Colorado and Wyoming. I guess I haven't found the place I want to settle yet." "That sounds lonely," Grace said softly. Colt met her eyes. "It has been. But I've been saving my money, learning everything I can. Someday I want my own ranch, a place to build something lasting. Just haven't found the right spot yet, or maybe the right reason to stop moving." Their food arrived, and for a while they ate in comfortable silence. Grace couldn't remember the last time she'd had a meal she didn't have to cook herself, or beef this tender. She savored every bite. "What about you?" Colt asked. "What do you do besides take care of your father?" "Mending work mostly, some washing. I'm good with a needle." Grace smiled slightly. "My mother taught me to sew. She was wonderful at it, could make a dress that looked like it came from a catalog. I'm not as talented as she was, but I do all right." "I bet you're better than you think." "Maybe." Grace set down her fork and looked at him directly. "Mr. Turner, I need to ask, why are you really doing this? You could be spending your money on whiskey and cards like most cowboys after a long drive. Why sit here with me?" Colt was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Honest truth. When I saw you today after you'd cut your hair, there was something in your face that reminded me of my mother. That same look of someone who'd do anything, sacrifice anything, for the people they love. It stirred something in me." He paused. "And if I'm being completely honest, I noticed you the first day I rode into town. Thought you were the prettiest woman I'd seen in a long time. Finding out you're also brave and devoted just makes you more remarkable." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Maybe not yet, but I'd like to." Colt's blue eyes were steady on hers. "If you'll let me." Something in Grace's chest loosened, a knot of loneliness she hadn't even fully acknowledged. She'd been so focused on survival, on keeping her father alive, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything other than a struggling girl barely holding things together. "I'd like that too," she said quietly. They talked through the rest of the meal, and then through coffee and pie. Colt told her stories about life on the trail, about rivers crossed and stampedes narrowly averted, about the vast stretches of prairie under endless sky. Grace told him about growing up in Montana City, about helping her father in his workshop, about her mother's garden that she struggled to maintain alone. When they finally left the restaurant, full dark had fallen. Colt walked her home through streets lit by scattered lanterns and starlight. At her gate, he paused. "I meant what I said earlier. I want to help. Let me at least bring by some supplies tomorrow. Firewood, food, anything you need." Grace wanted to refuse on principle, but practicality won out. "We could use firewood, and coffee if you're offering." "My father loves coffee, but I've been rationing it. Coffee and firewood then. I'll bring them by mid-morning." Colt hesitated, then reached out and gently touched her hand. "Thank you for tonight, Grace. It was the best evening I've had in a long time. Thank you for the meal. And for listening." She slipped inside, her heart beating faster than it should, and found her father awake and waiting. "Well," Thomas asked, his voice weak but curious, "tell me about this cowboy." Grace sat beside his bed and describing Colt Turner and his steady eyes, his easy manner, the way he'd shared his own story of loss without making it a burden. Her father listened, and though he looked worried, he also looked relieved. "You need more than just me, Grace," he said when she finished. "You need friends, maybe more than friends. You deserve happiness." "Right now, I need you to get well," Grace said firmly. "That's all I'm thinking about." But as she lay in her own narrow bed that night, her hand kept going to her short hair, and she kept thinking about blue eyes and a gentle voice offering help without making her feel small. Colt arrived the next morning with a wagon full of split firewood and enough supplies to stock a small store. Grace opened the door to find him unloading logs, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the September chill. "This is too much," she protested as he carried in coffee, flour, sugar, smoked meat, and canned goods. "It's enough to get you through a few weeks," Colt said. "Until your father's medicine arrives and he starts getting better. Please, Grace, let me do this." She wanted to argue, but the truth was that every item he brought in was something she desperately needed and couldn't afford. Pride warred with necessity, and necessity won. "Thank you," she said instead. "I don't know how to repay you. Don't worry about repaying me." Colt stacked the last of the firewood neatly by the door. "Just focus on your father. Would you like to meet him? He's been curious about you." Colt's face brightened. "I'd be honored." Thomas Johnson was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than he had in days. He studied Colt with a father's protective scrutiny as Grace made introductions. "Mr. Johnson," Colt said respectfully, removing his hat. "It's good to meet you, sir. Grace has told me you're a carpenter." "Was a carpenter," Thomas corrected, his voice rough. "Not much good for anything now." "You're good for being my father," Grace said firmly. "That's the most important thing." Colt spent the next half hour talking with Thomas about carpentry, asking intelligent questions about joinery and tools, clearly showing genuine interest. Grace watched from the doorway, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. It had been so long since her father had anyone to talk to about his craft, since he'd been able to share the knowledge he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. When Colt finally took his leave, Thomas waited until they heard the door close, then looked at his daughter. "He's a good man," Thomas said simply. "I think so too," Grace admitted. "Be careful with your heart, sweetheart, but don't be so careful that you miss something real." Over the next 2 weeks, Colt became a regular presence in Grace's life. He came by every day, sometimes bringing more supplies, sometimes just sitting with Thomas and keeping him company while Grace did her mending work. Other times he convinced Grace to take a break and walk with him through town or along the creek that ran behind the settlement. She learned that he was thoughtful and patient, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise, that he listened more than he talked. She learned that he'd taught himself to read during long winter evenings, that he sent money to his siblings when they needed it, that he'd once walked 3 miles through a snowstorm to get help for an injured fellow cowhand. He learned that Grace had a sharp wit beneath her quiet demeanor, that she loved thunderstorms and the smell of pine, that she could quote entire passages from the handful of books she owned. He learned that she sang while she worked, soft melodies her mother had taught her, and that she had a way with growing things despite the harsh Montana soil. They were falling in love, though neither said it aloud. Thomas watched the courtship with mixed feelings. He was grateful for Colt's help, genuinely liked the young man, but he worried about what would happen when the cattle drive moved on. Cowboys were wanderers by nature. What if Colt left and broke his daughter's heart? The medicine arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by stage from Helena. Doc Miller brought it himself, along with careful instructions for dosing. Thomas took the first spoonful that evening, grimacing at the bitter taste, but willing to try anything. "Now we wait and pray," Doc Miller said, closing his medical bag. "Keep him warm. Make sure he takes the medicine 3 times a day and send for me if the fever spikes." Grace nodded, exhaustion and hope warring in her expression. Colt had been there when the medicine arrived and stayed as Doc Miller gave his instructions. Now, as the doctor left, Colt gently turned Grace toward him. "He's going to get better," Colt said firmly. "You don't know that. I believe it, and you should too." Grace sagged against him for just a moment, letting herself accept the comfort of his solid presence. "I'm scared. What if it doesn't work? What if I cut my hair and took your help and it still isn't enough?" Colt wrapped his arms around her, careful and respectful, just holding her while she trembled. "Then we'll figure out what to do next, but don't give up before we even start." She pulled back enough to look up at him, and something in his face made her breath catch. He looked at her like she was precious, like her shorn hair and worn dress didn't matter, like she was the most important thing in his world. "Colt," she whispered. He cupped her face gently, his calloused thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I know we haven't known each other long. I know this isn't the time, but Grace, you need to know that I care about you, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time." "I care about you too," she admitted. "It scares me." "Scares me too," he smiled slightly. "But good things are usually scary, I think. They matter too much not to be." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a question and a promise all at once. Grace kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady under her palms. For just that moment, she let herself believe that everything might actually be all right. The first week of treatment showed little change. Thomas continued to have fevers and coughing fits that left him exhausted. Grace tried not to panic, remembering Doc Miller's warning that the medicine would take time to work. Colt was there every evening, steady and patient, never suggesting that his help might have been wasted. The second week, Thomas seemed worse. His fever spiked high enough that Grace sent for the doctor in the middle of the night, terrified that they were losing him. Doc Miller came and stayed until dawn, using cool cloths and careful ministrations to bring the fever down. "This might be the crisis point," the doctor said quietly to Grace while Thomas slept fitfully. "Sometimes the body fights hardest right before it heals. Keep giving him the medicine, keep him comfortable, and have faith." Grace sat by her father's bedside all that day and into the night. Colt brought her food she barely touched and coffee she drank mechanically. He didn't try to make her leave or rest, just sat with her, his presence a quiet anchor. "You should go," Grace said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "You've done so much already. You don't need to watch this." "I'm not leaving you," Colt said simply. "Not unless you really want me to go." She reached for his hand and he held on tight. Thomas's fever broke just before dawn. One moment he was burning hot, the next he was drenched in sweat and his skin was cool to the touch. He opened his eyes, more lucid than he'd been in days, and managed a weak smile. "Still here," he rasped. Grace burst into tears, relief overwhelming her. "Still here. Papa, you're going to be all right." And slowly, incrementally, he was. Each day brought small improvements. The coughing eased. His appetite returned. Color came back to his face. By the third week, he was sitting up for longer periods, even managing a few steps around the room with Grace's help. "It's working," Doc Miller said with satisfaction during one of his visits. "Keep up with the medicine for another month, but I believe your father's going to recover, Grace." She could hardly believe it. After months of watching him fade, seeing him grow stronger felt like witnessing a miracle. She thanked God and the medicine and Doc Miller, but mostly she was grateful for the cowboy who had appeared at exactly the right moment and refused to let her face everything alone. Colt's cattle drive crew had long since moved on, but he'd stayed in Montana City, taking odd jobs around town to pay for his room at the boarding house. He helped at the livery stable, did some carpentry work as Thomas grew well enough to supervise, even filled in as a deputy when the town marshal needed an extra hand for a few days. "You didn't have to stay," Grace said one evening as they walked by the creek. It was late October now, the air crisp with coming winter, the cottonwoods turning gold. "Your crew left weeks ago." "I wanted to stay," Colt said. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I stayed because of you, Grace. You have to know that." Her heart beat faster. "What happens when winter comes? You can't keep taking odd jobs forever." "I've been thinking about that." Colt took her hands in his. "Your father's going to need time to build his strength back, to rebuild his business. I could help him. We could go into partnership, maybe. I've got carpentry skills and I'm good with my hands. In the spring, if things work out, I could buy some land outside town and start that ranch I've been dreaming about. You'd stay in Montana City, permanently, if I had a reason to. His blue eyes were intense on hers. Grace, I'm in love with you. I think I started falling that first day when you were so brave and scared at the same time. Every day since then, I've fallen deeper. I want to build a life here. I want to build it with you. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were happy tears. I love you too. I didn't think I had room in my life for anything except taking care of Papa, but you made room. You made me remember that I'm not just a daughter or a seamstress. I'm a woman who can be loved. Colt pulled her close and kissed her, deeper and more passionate than before, no longer so careful. Grace kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been holding in, all the fear and hope and love that had been building for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. I know it's fast. I know we should probably wait longer. But Grace, will you marry me? Let me take care of you the way you've taken care of everyone else. Let me love you for the rest of my life. Yes, Grace said without hesitation. Yes, absolutely yes. They walked back to her house hand in hand, giddy and laughing like children. Thomas was awake when they arrived, looking stronger than he had in months, and he took one look at their faces and started smiling. I take it congratulations are in order, he asked. We're getting married, Papa, Grace said, her face glowing. Colt asked me to marry him and I said yes. Thomas held out his hand to Colt, and when the younger man took it, Thomas pulled him into an embrace. You take care of my girl. That's all I ask. I will, sir. I promise you that. Colt stepped back, suddenly looking nervous. I should have asked your permission first. That was disrespectful. You've been asking my permission every day for the past month, Thomas said with a wheezing laugh. Every time you brought supplies, every time you sat with me, every time you made my daughter smile. You've more than earned the right to marry her. They were married in November, a small ceremony in the little church on the edge of town. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slimmer frame, and a bonnet that covered her hair, which was slowly growing back in soft curls. Colt wore new clothes bought special for the occasion and looked more nervous than Grace had ever seen him. Thomas walked her down the aisle, leaning on her arm but standing straight and proud. Doc Miller was there, and Mrs. Chen and Mr. Hutchison, and what felt like half the town, all people who had watched Grace struggle and were happy to see her joy. When the preacher said Colt could kiss his bride, he did so tenderly, with a reverence that made more than one person in the congregation dab at their eyes. They moved into a small house Colt had rented, with room for Thomas once he was strong enough to live more independently. For now, he stayed in the old house with a woman from church checking on him daily, but he had dinner with Colt and Grace every Sunday. Colt and Thomas did go into partnership, Turner and Johnson Carpentry. Thomas provided the expertise and designs, while Colt provided the physical labor and business sense. They started getting contracts for furniture, and even a few building projects as word spread about the quality of their work. Grace continued taking and mending, not because she had to anymore, but because she found she enjoyed it. She also started making clothes from scratch, beautiful dresses and shirts that people began requesting specially. Her talent, nurtured carefully, began to flourish. Winter came to Montana territory, cold and harsh, but their little house was warm. Colt made sure they had plenty of firewood, and Grace made sure they had good food and a comfortable home. They learned each other's rhythms, the give and take of marriage, the comfort of coming home to someone who loved you. On the coldest nights, they lay in bed wrapped in quilts, talking about their dreams. Colt described the ranch he wanted, the horses he'd raise, the cattle he'd run. Grace talked about maybe opening a dress shop someday, hiring other women who needed work, creating something lasting. "We'll do all of it," Colt promised, kissing her temple. "Every single dream." In the spring, Thomas was well enough to work full days again, though he tired more easily than before. He'd gained back most of the weight he'd lost, and the hollowness was gone from his face. He moved into a small apartment above the carpentry shop, maintaining his independence but never far from Grace and Colt. Colt bought land 5 miles outside Montana City, a beautiful stretch along a creek with good grass and natural shelter. He built a barn first, then started on a house, working with Thomas on the design. It would be bigger than what they needed right away, with room to grow. In June, Grace told Colt she was pregnant. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then set her down carefully as if she might break. "We're having a baby," he said wonderingly. "Grace, we're going to have a family." "We already have a family," she corrected, touching his face. "But yes, we're making it bigger." The baby, a son, was born in February during a snowstorm so fierce the doctor almost couldn't make it through. But he did, and Colt held Grace's hand through the long hours of labor, never leaving her side. They named the boy Thomas Colt Turner, honoring both his grandfather and his father. Little Tommy, they called him. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong frame, and both grandfathers doted on him shamelessly. Grace's hair had grown back to shoulder length by then, honey-colored waves that Colt loved to run his fingers through. She sometimes thought about that desperate day in Mrs. Chen's shop, when she'd sacrificed her one vanity for her father's life. It seemed like something from another lifetime now, a different Grace who'd been so alone and scared. "You regret it?" Colt asked one evening, watching her brush her hair in front of the mirror. "Cutting your hair?" Grace turned to look at him, this man who had changed everything. "Not for 1 second. If I hadn't been desperate enough to do that, I might not have been vulnerable enough to accept your help. I might have been too proud to let you in." "You'd have let me in eventually," Colt said confidently, pulling her into his lap. "I can be very persistent." She laughed and kissed him. "I noticed." They moved into the ranch house that spring, a beautiful place with big windows and a wide porch. Thomas had his own room when he wanted to stay over, and he was there often, teaching his grandson to use wooden blocks and telling him stories about his grandmother. Colt built up the horse herd slowly, buying good breeding stock and breaking them with patience and skill. He hired 2 hands to help with the work, young men glad for steady employment. The ranch began to establish a reputation for quality horses, and buyers came from as far as Wyoming and Dakota Territory. Grace did open her dress shop, a small storefront in Montana City that she visited 3 days a week. She hired 2 seamstresses who needed work and could use the steady income. The shop became known for well-made, affordable clothing and for treating its workers fairly. Life was good. Hard sometimes, the way frontier life always was, but good. On their 5th anniversary, Colt took Grace back to the hotel restaurant where they'd had their first meal together. She wore a dress she'd made herself, deep green that brought out her eyes, and her hair was long again, pinned up in a style that made Colt's breath catch. "You remember that first night?" he asked, holding her hand across the table. "How nervous we both were." "I remember thinking I shouldn't be there, that I should be home taking care of Papa," Grace smiled. "I'm so glad I didn't listen to that voice. I'm glad you gave me a chance." Colt raised his glass. "To 5 years and to 50 more. They had more children over the years, 3 more in total. A daughter named Caroline, who had her mother's determination and her father's blue eyes. Then twin boys, Jacob and James, who were holy terrors from the moment they could walk and kept everyone on their toes." Thomas lived to see all his grandchildren, to teach them carpentry and tell them stories about their grandmother. He passed peacefully in his sleep when he was 68, having lived more than a decade past what anyone expected after his illness. At his funeral, Grace held Colt's hand and cried, but they were tears of gratitude as much as grief. "He had time," she said to Colt that night. "Because of you, because of that medicine, he had time to see me happy, to know his grandchildren. That's everything." "You gave him that time," Colt corrected. "Your sacrifice made it possible. We gave it to him," Grace said firmly. "Together." The ranch prospered. Turner Ranch became known throughout Montana Territory for the finest horses and the fairest dealings. Colt expanded into cattle as well, running a modest herd that provided steady income. He treated his workers well, paying fair wages and providing decent housing, which meant good men wanted to work for him. Grace's dress shop grew too, eventually employing 6 seamstresses and taking orders from all over the territory. She found satisfaction in providing good work for women who needed it, in creating beautiful things, in building something that was entirely hers even as she was fully part of the ranch and family. Their children grew up knowing they were loved, knowing the story of how their parents met. Grace always told them that sometimes the hardest moments in life lead to the best things. That sacrifice made with love is never wasted, that being brave enough to accept help can change everything. Tommy became a rancher like his father, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day operations of Turner Ranch. Caroline surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, opening a small school in Montana City where she taught children to read and write. The twins went into business together, expanding the carpentry shop their grandfather had started into a thriving lumber mill. Through it all, through the growing and changing and building, Colt and Grace remained at the center. Their love the foundation everything else was built on. They still took walks by the creek when they could steal the time. They still talked about their dreams, though now those dreams were mostly about grandchildren and legacy, about the life they'd built together. On their 25th anniversary, Colt gave Grace a surprise. He'd commissioned a painting from an artist passing through Montana, working from an old photograph taken just after their wedding. In the painting, Grace's hair was short, her face young, but her eyes shone with the same love and determination that had first caught his attention. "I wanted to remember you exactly as you were," Colt said as Grace stared at the painting with tears in her eyes. "When you were the bravest person I'd ever met, willing to sacrifice anything for the people you loved." "I'm looking at the second bravest person I ever met," Grace said, turning to embrace her husband. "The one who was willing to help a stranger, to stay in a town that wasn't his, to build a whole life because he believed in love." "Best decision I ever made," Colt said, kissing her softly. They hung the painting in the main room of the ranch house, where everyone who visited could see it. It became a family treasure, a reminder of where they'd started, of the sacrifices and choices that had brought them to this good life. More years passed. Montana Territory became Montana State. The wild days faded into memory, replaced by schools and churches and established towns. Montana City grew, connected by railroad to the wider world, becoming prosperous and civilized. Colt's hair turned silver, and Grace's showed threads of white among the honey-colored strands. They moved a little slower, rested more often, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, burnished by decades of partnership and shared life. They became grandparents many times over, their home filled with the laughter and chaos of visiting children and grandchildren. Colt taught the boys to ride and rope. Grace taught the girls to sew and manage a household, but also to dream big, to build businesses, to be brave. On a warm evening in August, when they were both well into their 60s, Colt and Grace sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Their granddaughter Sarah was visiting, a serious girl of 14 who loved to hear stories about the old days. "Grandma," Sarah asked, "do you ever wish you'd kept your hair? That you hadn't had to cut it?" Grace reached over and took Colt's hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "You know what I've learned, sweetheart? The things we sacrifice for love are never really lost. I cut my hair to save my father, and that led me to your grandfather. Those few months of looking different gave me a whole lifetime of being loved. That's a trade I'd make 1,000 times over. And I learned," Colt added, squeezing his wife's hand, "that the best thing you can do with your blessings is share them. I had some money and saw someone who needed help. Helping Grace brought me more joy than anything I could have bought for myself." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, absorbing this wisdom. "I want to find a love like yours someday." "You will," Grace said confidently. "Just remember to be brave enough to accept help when you need it, and generous enough to offer it when you can. The rest tends to work itself out." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Colt pulled Grace closer. She rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For seeing me that day, for caring, for staying." "Thank you for letting me," Colt replied. "For being brave enough to trust a stranger who promised to help." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, surrounded by the life they'd built together, the family they'd created, the love that had sustained them through hard times and good. The ranch spread out around them, prosperous and peaceful. Somewhere in the house, Sarah was probably writing in her journal, recording the stories of her grandparents for future generations. Grace thought about that desperate girl she'd been, walking out of Mrs. Chen's shop with shorn hair and $50 clutched in her hand. She thought about the cowboy who'd noticed her distress and refused to look away. She thought about all the moments, small and large, that had led them here, and she was grateful for every single one. Years later, when Colt and Grace had both passed on peacefully into their 80s, their children gathered at the ranch to divide belongings and reminisce. The painting of young Grace with her short hair had a place of honor in Tommy's home, where he could tell his own grandchildren about sacrifice and love, about cowboys and courage, about how sometimes the hardest moments lead to the greatest blessings. The dress shop still operated in Montana City, now run by Caroline's daughter. Turner Ranch still bred the finest horses in Montana, now operated by Tommy's sons and daughters. The lumber mill provided good jobs and fair wages, carrying on the twins' legacy of ethical business. But more than businesses or property, Colt and Grace left behind a family that knew how to love fiercely, sacrifice bravely, and help generously. They left behind children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in land or money, but in the lives you touched and the love you shared. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires, at weddings and christenings. The cowboy who stayed to help a desperate girl, the girl who was brave enough to accept that help and trust in love. In the cemetery on the hill above Montana City, 2 stones stood side by side. Colt Turner, it read on one, beloved husband, father, grandfather. Grace Turner, read the other, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. Between them, someone had planted wildflowers that bloomed every spring, honey-colored and resilient, beautiful and enduring as the love story they represented. And in the small museum that Montana City eventually established, celebrating its frontier heritage, There hung a painting of a young woman with short hair and determined eyes, standing beside a tall cowboy with a gentle smile. The placard beneath reads simply, Grace and Colt Turner, 1878. A testament to love, sacrifice, and the courage to accept help when it was offered. Their story lived on, generation after generation, a reminder that sometimes the most desperate moments bring the greatest gifts, that love can bloom in the hardest soil, and that having the courage to help someone or to accept help can change not just two lives, but create a legacy that endures forever. The end of their story was really just the beginning of so many others. All the lives they touched and influenced, all the love they spread out into the world like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Colt and Grace Turner lived and loved and built something beautiful, and that beauty echoed down through time, a gift to everyone who came after them. In Montana, where the mountains meet the sky and the prairie grass bends in the wind, their story is still told. The cowboy and the girl who sold her hair, the sacrifice and the help offered, the love that grew from desperation into something strong and lasting and true. It's a story about the Wild West, about survival and hardship, but more than that, it's a story about the best of human nature, about what we become when we choose love over fear, generosity over selfishness, together over alone. And it's a reminder that sometimes, in our darkest moments, when we think we have nothing left to give, when we've sacrificed everything we have, that's exactly when grace appears, often in unexpected forms, sometimes in the shape of a cowboy with blue eyes and a generous heart, ready to say the words that change everything. Let me help you now.